So, are some people truly above the moral law? I mean, could an extraordinary individual commit a horrific, brutal crime and just walk away without a single shred of guilt? It's a pretty chilling thought, right? But it actually forms the entire psychological bedrock of the story we're diving into today.
That very question sits at the dark heart of Fyodor Dostoevsky's legendary 1866 text, Crime and Punishment. In this explainer, we're going to unpack the suffocating guilt and the wildly turbulent journey toward redemption of a destitute former student who commits a brutal murder. And we'll be looking at all of this through a modern psychiatric lens to really understand that eternal struggle between good and evil.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the mind of a murderer, look at the trap of nihilism, dive into the author's own crucible, explore the weight of guilt, and wrap up with redemption through suffering. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The Mind of a Murderer. We begin our journey right inside the mind of a brilliant but completely destitute former student named Rodion Raskolnikov. Picture this guy. He's completely isolated from humanity, living in this tiny, dusty 5-story walk-up that's honestly more like a closet than a room. He is crushed by poverty. He's walking the sweltering streets of Petersburg in absolute rags, literally dodging his landlady because he's so hopelessly in debt. But beneath that pathetic exterior, he is meticulously plotting what he calls a hideous dream, the murder of a cynical, withered old pawnbroker named Alyona Ivanovna. He even counts the exact 730 steps from his place to her flat. And the craziest part is he tries to justify this brutal act using scientific rationalism, convincing himself he's actually doing a noble thing. The whole engine driving Raskolnikov's justification is this concept of the Superman, or as it was later formalized by philosophers like Nietzsche, the Übermensch. Basically, it's the belief that certain, quote-unquote, extraordinary individuals actually have the right to break human and moral laws. You know, the rules rooted in tradition or religion. They can just invent their own values. Raskolnikov honestly believes that because he's superior, he can commit this murder without facing any negative psychological blowback. He thinks he's totally exempt from the consequences that would absolutely crush an ordinary person.
Which brings us to Part 2, the trap of nihilism. Now, to understand how a chilling, detached mindset like that even breeds in the first place, we have to zoom out. Imagine 19th century Russia. We are talking about an agrarian, pre-industrial world where literally 90% of the population lived in serfdom. That's essentially slavery. Literacy rates were incredibly low. The text vividly describes the insufferable stench of Petersburg, drunken men stumbling out of taverns, and just extreme, crushing poverty everywhere. So the key takeaway here is that these hellish, inhumane conditions made radical philosophy super attractive to an oppressed public. It was a desperate form of rebellion against the ruling class. And the most radical of those philosophies? Nihilism. Gaining major traction in Russia in the early 19th century, nihilism completely rejects traditional social constructs and authority, meaning the state, the family, the church, and all the accepted moral rules that go with them. It essentially argues there's no higher power, and that life's meaning only comes from utilitarianism and cold, hard scientific rationalism. Well, Dostoevsky used his novel as a massive, direct critique of this exact philosophy. He wanted to show us what actually happens to a human being, and by extension a whole society, when they toss out their moral bedrock and try to live purely on cold logic.
Part 3. The Author's Crucible. You see, Dostoevsky didn't just observe this darkness safely from afar. He actually lived through an almost unimaginable crucible himself. His own life perfectly mirrored the psychological torture he'd end up writing about. He actually started out as a young man from an aristocratic family with a very promising career, but his path took a radical, terrifying turn.
Get this. In 1847, a young Dostoevsky joined the Petrashevsky Circle, which was this utopian socialist group discussing the end of serfdom. By 1849, the Tsarist government cracked down, seized the group, and threw them into a maximum security prison with horrific conditions. After 8 months of interrogation, they were sentenced to death. On December 22, 1849, Dostoevsky was literally taken to a public square, lined up before a firing squad, and prepared to die. But at the very last possible second, a messenger arrived with a pardon. It was a mock execution. Instead of death, he was sent to a brutal Siberian labor camp for 4 years. Standing before those guns completely shattered his utopian illusions forever. He realized that those very utopian ideas were actually a breeding ground for atheistic, materialistic, and nihilistic attitudes.
Let's move to Part 4, the weight of guilt.
So, bringing it back to Raskolnikov, After he actually commits the murder, he quickly finds out that reality does not align with his Superman theory. Not at all. As it turns out, the external legal punishment of being exiled to a Siberian labor camp, that's actually a relief compared to his internal punishment. Inside his own head, Raskolnikov is absolutely wrecked by suffocating anxiety. He suffers from severe delirium, punishing nightmares, and a violent physiological reaction that he never, ever anticipated.
While Raskolnikov tries so hard to consciously justify his violence, his own body literally betrays him. It contradicts his logic. Psychiatrists analyzing the text point out that this inner guilt is his true punishment. The psychological fallout basically proves the existence of a hardwired, undeniable internal moral code. Dostoevsky is making a huge existential argument here. We humans simply cannot bypass morality without suffering profound, inescapable psychological consequences. The murder breaks Raskolnikov fundamentally, not because he violated state law, but because he violated a deeply ingrained human law.
Finally, Part 5. Redemption through suffering.
But thankfully, Dostoevsky doesn't just leave us in despair. He offers a way out of the dark, specifically through the incredibly powerful women in the story. Look at the contrast between two different responses to deep suffering. First, you have Katerina Ivanovna, the stepmother. She's terribly emaciated, coughing blood, living in abject squalor, but she is completely trapped by her old aristocratic pride. She refuses to admit her own bad choices, abuses her family, and tragically dies in the streets, stubbornly refusing any spiritual help, claiming she has no sin. On the flip side, we have her stepdaughter, Sonia Marmeladov. Sonia is forced into prostitution, taking what was called a yellow ticket just to feed her starving siblings and fund her father's severe alcoholism. But despite suffering arguably way more than Raskolnikov, she maintains this pure, beautiful selflessness. The world abuses her, but it doesn't break her spirit. Instead, she becomes Raskolnikov's redemptive angel. It just goes to show how our response to suffering can either absolutely destroy us or ultimately save us.
It's actually fascinating how modern psychiatrists look at characters like Sonia and see perfect parallels to something called logotherapy. Logotherapy posits that suffering is just an inevitable part of the human experience, and as doctors will tell you, true healing requires actually moving through the pain and looking inward, rather than just medicating it away or ignoring the root cause. Finding your own unique meaning within a crisis is a profound strength. Sonia takes her specific suffering and her deep spirituality and uses them as a transformative tool, not a life sentence. As Dostoevsky noted, true freedom isn't about dodging pain. It's about looking at reality soberly and embracing it, even the absolute darkest parts.
Dostoevsky actually explored this exact kind of transformation again in his later novel, The Idiot, pulling directly from the terror of his own mock execution. The character Prince Mishkin reflects, "What if I didn't have to die? If life was returned to me, what an eternity it would be. And it would be all mine. I would turn every minute into an age. Nothing would be wasted." Wow. That haunting reflection beautifully captures the ultimate realization that suffering, and even standing right on the edge of death, can unlock immense gratitude and a profound spiritual awakening. It's that turning point where suffering ceases to be just pain and literally becomes the vehicle for your own personal rebirth. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We've seen how Raskolnikov's attempt to play Superman resulted in a total, devastating psychological collapse. It proves that we really can't outsmart our own conscience. So if the internal torment of guilt is inescapable, and we are all bound by this undeniable psychological law, what forms the bedrock of your moral code? When you're faced with the inevitable suffering of life, how will you choose to navigate your own moral compass? Something to think about.